And when I was, initially I started podcasting just audio, and that was simply because I was bored during lockdown. And I had Wimarshana Wijesuriya on as a guest on my second episode. And at that time, he had written his books, and I was just freshly graduating high school, and he was one of my teachers. And now it's 5 years later, and the podcast that I had forgotten about, I decided to restart, and I'm having Wimarshana back because the episode we did back in 2021, almost 5 years ago, charted, and it was number one on Apple Podcasts in the region. Hi, Wimarshana, how are you?
Hi, great to be back with Pulesh. Actually, I missed that. It seemed like only a few years ago, but I can't believe it was 5 now. But that was a lot of fun and very engaging, and yeah.
Yeah,
So
I can't believe it's been 5 years.
yeah,
Too,
I know,
especially
right?
because I had just graduated high school, and
Yeah,
now here I am post college,
yeah.
and yeah,
That's crazy though.
crazy.
5 years. It just seems like 5 months. Yeah, good times. Lot has happened since then.
Yeah, a lot. And when you say 5 years has passed and it's been so fast, I'm starting to realize the older I get, the faster time seems to move, and that might just be because of the adult routine setting in. But
Yeah, oh, definitely. Like basically a year, every decade, the year gets like halved in terms of felt time. So like a year between 0 and 10 feels like, eternity, but a year between, say 30 and 40, which you're not at, feels like, a millisecond almost sometimes.
there's nothing like a 20-year-old that feels like he's running out of time. So I'm feeling the pressure already, and I'm not even halfway through my 20s.
All I can say is don't feel the pressure, but definitely enjoy every second, because often that comes in the 40s, and you're like, if I had this attitude much earlier, I would have just had the most amazing life.
I really hope, because right now I'm just feeling all of that pressure. There's just like some fire that makes me feel like I'm running out of time and I'm about to die and I need to do everything right now. Anyways, why did I start to podcast again? Is mainly because, unlike 2021, the podcasting software has come really far. I think you've noticed too.
Oh, yeah.
Back then, we just called online, and I had to sit there and edit every single pause out
Yeah.
individually on our audio files, and that was tedious. 3 episodes in, I didn't want to do it anymore. Yeah,
the deep breathing into the mic.
exactly. But now there's software that I can just upload files onto, and AI just does everything for me. It edits it, it removes all of the pauses, the filler words, and I don't know, podcasting has just become so simple now. I thought, why not?
Yeah, as long as
And-
it doesn't give the content, which it's not this time.
Yeah, but the process has actually gotten very
Yeah.
simple. It was quite shocking to see how far this had come in 5 years, and it was really the main reason. And the second reason being that I wrote a book in 2024, and
Wow.
I published it in 2024, and you've written 3 books now, I believe.
My fourth one was out like March 27.
Yeah,
That's
you've written
the
4
one
books
that.
now.
But that's
And
incredible,
before-
and you're in your 20s and you start then. That's just like, yeah, I started much, much later than you, so that's great.
But most people, well, like most people, I had a lot of sort of uninformed optimism when I was writing my first few chapters. I was breezing through the 5,000 word chapters, and I thought, oh, I could probably write a book like every 2 years. It's not going to be too hard. But my God, once you get halfway through and you've sort of like exhausted your initial ideas, that level of informed pessimism sets in, and then the process just takes months and years.
It's
to
one of
get
the hardest things. Like, basically, writing a book is one of the hardest intellectual and personal tasks, unless, of course, it's and I'm sure, obviously, your one's not, but like, unless you're writing like one of those cookie cutter crime novellas or something, which are terrible. But every age has them, Pulp Fiction kind of thing. It is really. It's a labor of love, and often not for much reward. That's not why we do it. Yeah. So it is basically it is a full time. It's a full time job in terms of hours sometimes, and it's a calling. So it's just like My last one took 9 years, and I hate to say that because it just I think what the hell was I doing? But I finally finished it. But it is very very yeah. I mean, you can have all these sort of tools and help and everything, but in the end, the words have to be yours and they have to be heartfelt and meant. It's a creditable thing that a person your age has finished a book.
I mean, to be fair, I was so exhausted once I had finished the book and sort of going through the grammar checks and spelling
Mm.
checks that I just started hiring contractors and outsourcing all of the editorial work because there was no way I was sitting down and re-editing that book
It's
7 more
tedious,
times.
man.
There's just
It's
no chance.
tedious.
Yeah,
It's
and the podcast,
really.
yeah, and the podcast was almost the same. It was just tedious to go through it, and then I feel like the softwares have come along now where I can just plug them in and they find all the errors, and I can just
Mm.
click one button and they're all gone.
I mean, like, I feel that these tools have they're a double-edged sword. Like, I have my latest book is 99 thoughts on modern life, but in poetry form.
Hmm.
In befitting modern heresy, it's the way you shouldn't write poetry. So basically one of them is about this, like all these tools make more people enter, but the ease shouldn't be the reason you enter, because what happens then is the substance suffers. So I love these tools, but there's really no way to make sure that the tools are only available to a person like you who's passionate about the substance of the book or the podcast, because when it's difficult, only the serious enter. That has its own advantages. So this it's a double-edged sword. It's like anybody can write a book now, but they're writing it for the cachet of saying I wrote a book. Whereas you should write a book because you can't not.
I think there's a statistic that most people who podcast end up quitting before their 20th episode. And I
Yeah.
guess in my case, it was true the first time I started this because I
Hmm.
quit after the third episode. But this
Yeah.
time I'm hoping it has a more prolonged life. And one of the main reasons why I thought this was the perfect time to was because social media transitioned from homemade content to this marketing tool that's
Mm.
now driving culture.
Mm.
And now we have all of these brands and all of these businesses trying
Yeah.
desperately to control the narrative. And even I think it was this week where OpenAI bought one of the biggest tech podcasts out of Silicon Valley
Mm.
because the consensus on artificial intelligence was so negative that they thought it's probably time they started doing more marketing towards their own products. And
Mm.
I feel like podcasts alone open a lot of opportunities without putting you in the niche of an influencer. So
Mm.
it seemed like the perfect time to throw my name in the hat of like founder-led marketing and business philosophy, economics-based podcasts. And I have a bunch of guests lined up for the next few episodes, mostly corporate, see how it goes, find my
Mm.
footing, discover a niche, and then carry on from there. But there was pretty much no doubt that I should probably bring back the guest who I got the number one podcast in the country a few years ago. And here we are starting again.
Yeah, man, there's a lot of people who want to actually watch this live, to be honest. Like, they wanted to, like, because when I told them, like, it wasn't just, just the recording, it's us appearing, more like a show. Yeah, they wanted to join live, but I'm sure they can join now. Yeah. So, yeah, it's,
Yeah,
it's, it's, it's one of those things where, I equate it to like the freedom of speech, all this technology and these platforms. The individual has to say, just because they have the right to say something, say in the freedom of speech, that doesn't mean they have to say something. When you get on these platforms, now I know that you have, like, some of the things you said told me in the brief, I actually didn't know that stuff. I had to like research. So what I found in that is there was a substance, there was a girth, there was a there was something there which was of value. But sometimes what happens is, because people can, they jump in and then they're like, what now? And that is what brings the culture down, right? Like, it's just drowning out the important voices when there's a trillion of everything. Yeah. But there's no way that there can be some kind of like, otherwise it's censorship or at least gatekeeping. So the individuals have to know, look, just because I have these tools, it's possible. I can't just I shouldn't. I can, but I shouldn't just get on and just say stuff and pollute the space or cram up the space.
Yeah. There's a running joke online that podcasting equipment should come with a license because not everyone should have a podcast
Yeah.
because we don't need to hear all the
Nah,
opinions.
this just runs up against democracy, right? Like that would
Yeah.
be better, but that would be anti-democratic, and it'll also keep some important voices out. So separating the wheat from the chaff is almost impossible. You know who I pity in all of this? Not us, the people who make stuff and get joy out of just, and fulfillment out of doing the thing, that we love. But imagine like getting online and trying to find this stuff.
Yeah.
Just imagine the amount of rubbish you have to sift through, which looks on the surface, it's got that veneer of, proper graphics, proper sound, editing, but there's nothing beneath that. So just imagine someone trying to find that.
I mean, there is quite an influx of content that gets published on a daily basis. Even I was surprised on how much you can distribute from very simple platforms. But let's talk about your books. Would you like to introduce what exactly you've written about, what the books are?
Yeah, definitely. So, Modern Heresy is a long journey to get here, but Modern Heresy is 99 thoughts on modern life. It is basically in poetry, but not the academic standard meter and verse and stanzas and everything, but more like, rap battle poetry. And what I wanted to do was, in fact, the medium itself, I find very novel because it is, uh, you know, uh, it comes out in rhyme and rap and that kind of a medium, but the substance, what I'm talking about, are where the pressing issues of living in this modern world. And, I always say this modern world, right, especially this moment, okay, is, it's a garishly lit dark age. We are living in a dark age, which is lit neon bright. Yeah, this is a dark age. This is like, in 476, when Rome fell, the thousand-year dark ages. I'm not saying any event like that has happened yet, but this is a dark age in terms of art and music and literature. Yeah. Because commercial interests have totally dominated those to an extent which could not happen before because of technology. And this is a dark age for the masses because they, with all that we've come to, with all the things that all the progress we've made them not, we haven't opened their minds. We haven't, the anti-intellectualism is rife, okay, and there's so many like this shouldn't be happening, right? In a sense, like materially, well, now there are economic issues, but materially we are better off than, especially in the developed world, you're materially better off than your parents, definitely than your grandparents. But there's a depression, anxiety epidemic. Yeah, basically people are just sad, fat and lonely. It's not a stretch to say this modern project is an utter failure in terms of, not in terms of just technical progress. Perhaps AI and everything are wonders which you couldn't even imagine about of 10 years ago. But look at the average American. They're miserable. The all the great strides of the Enlightenment and all, we're going backwards. And the most telling example, no, sorry, the most telling manifestation of that is the election of Donald Trump, right? Like when a developed nation like America can elect Donald Trump, yeah, that shows the cancer here is in the low intellectual level to which we have sunk, yeah. So modern heresy, looks at the various aspects of this malaise, right? This is success in a particular way, but this is a humongous failure. The planet is almost dead, yeah, and people are miserable, right? So this is not because of war and famine, yeah. Earlier misery and that was war, famine, natural disaster. Those things obviously will persist. But is the rich, developed world so unhappy and also simultaneously killing the planet? Yeah. So what this shows is a abject move away from what is the good life in terms of philosophy. Modern heresy, it's cheeky, it's irreverent, it's one of those ones where a lot of the stodgy, buttoned up critics will have a lot of grammar issues and a lot of other politically correct issues. I would say I would not write it if it wasn't necessary. So it's an old school book, yeah,
Hmm.
with new school
Right.
language, but it's a book that I feel is necessary, and that's the only reason I wrote it. And maybe I didn't write it well, but I had to write it. So that's Modern Heresy. Yeah, I know that people are going to be up in arms about it, but yeah, I had to write it and I had to get it out of my system, and I did.
Right. And I think very similar to you, once I went through college, went through, the natural process of entering the workforce, I had a lot of questions for myself, a lot of questions about purpose and existence. And that's what eventually led me to existentialism as a whole. And that's what prompted my book, which was Sonder. It was less written for other people and more just written for myself and in my research and pursuit for meaning and an existential fear of an inconsequential life, I go through this process of introspection and then extrospection, where I look at the world with a macro lens and analyze things from mimetic theory and what exactly my desires are, where they come from, to ultimately analyzing social constructivism and how the world functions and why the world functions the way it does from a very philosophical yet scientific and psychological standpoint. While I wrote the book, I made it a point to really refer to only scientific cases and literature, because rationalized all of these philosophical existential ideas, tried and tested empirical evidence, and that gave me a lot of clarity. And I thought that clarity can be translated into a book. The name Sonder came from a coffee shop in Cape Town, South Africa. I was visiting over the summer with a bunch of friends, and the actual word means the realization that every random passerby is living a life
Yeah.
as vivid and complex as your own, populated with their own ambitions, routines, and inherited craziness. It's the understanding that you might be an extra
Mm,
sipping coffee in the background of someone else's epic story. And this sort of irrelevance in the world, yet your whole existence is the primary driver of your purpose, was a confusing theory and concept to get a grasp of. And existentialism almost became the nexus of my search for answers of my very existence. And because, like you said, a lot of people, even though they are currently in a state that is almost the best quality of life that humanity has ever experienced, objectively, we have a better standard of life than monarchs from
mm,
100 years ago. We have a better life than our grandparents, our parents, and now we experience technological luxuries, and even basic necessities are so abundant that we've lost the realization of what the essence and purpose of our life is, because we don't necessarily have that
mm,
survival drive anymore, and we rather have been left to discover that purpose on our own. And to a lot of us,
mm,
existence precedes essence, and there's no predetermined essence or purpose to human life. Individuals come into existence first and then define themselves through their actions and choices. So my book was just, what is the path of discovery as a 1 year old to find out what my purpose was. And I think I started the book, I think the very first chapter is almost what we discussed 5 years ago. It was Plato's cave. I started from the cave, and it's branched out into all of these different psychological theories and philosophical theories and economics that mapped how the world worked. So I thought we'd follow the same process with this podcast and start off with Plato's
mm.
allegory of the cave.
Oh yeah. What a great, I mean, after that contribution, Alfred North Whitehead, a great philosopher in his own right, said the whole of Western philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. That Plato and in other things as well, but also Plato's cave. Just, I mean, after that leap, that really illuminated exactly what's going on as much as it did 2000 plus years ago as it does now. I mean,
And
that was
Plato's
really
cave
genius.
weirdly meant something very different to me back when I was 19 years old, and it means something completely different to me now at 24. And I feel like it's one of those concepts that sort of evolve with you as you age, and it addresses different things in life that you come to experience as you travel through time. And just to explain what the allegory of the cave is, listening, it's basically an image where prisoners are chained and they face a wall, mistaking shadows cast by puppet masters for absolute reality. And to those poor chained souls, the shadows are the only truth. And they're comfortable living in ignorant bliss. And this connects to conversation where the idea of our understanding of the world is not necessarily objective all the time, but an interpretation shaped by social interaction. Concepts like money, nations, social hierarchy, they're all social constructs, imagined entities that only wield power because we collectively agree to believe in them. They are means to solve humanity's greatest coordination problem. And the cave almost represents all of those social constructs that the chained prisoners stare at and blindly follow without necessarily aching or yearning to understand more of. And I think that's what the very first part of that cave means to me currently with everything I've experienced.
Yeah, so yeah, basically the timelessness of that allegory is just the fact that the darkness and the ignorance that can come out time, they can come to preside and rule over the man on the street, that can change. But it will always be the man on the street is in darkness. Yeah, obviously in Plato's time, that was a very different kind of a darkness than it is now. Yeah, but they are as much in the cave as they were back in ancient Athens. And I would particularly point to the fact that, and I think what's fascinating is what is that darkness today? Yeah, it has always been there. In the medieval times, it was one particular thing by the church in Europe, and in different times, it was different things. In Nazi Germany, it was being blinded by Nazis. But now it's a very different thing. It's not this centralized source coming from religion. Now it's this, basically it's harder to explain than when the church said the church's dogmas and you had to believe them because it comes from multifarious sources. But one of them is, one of the darknesses that modern man faces, though it's very difficult to articulate, is the opposite of sonder, as you said. I didn't know what that meant until I Googled it today, but it made instant sense moment that I figured that out. It's solipsism. Yeah. The belief that only you exist in this universe and matter. Yeah. So the darkness of modern man is being so stuck in, look at something like gyms and self-improvement, right? The broader social, collectivism and trying to make society better have all been, the average person is looking at now in America, which is obviously still the preeminent developed country. So we have to look, this Rome, right? So we have to look to the center of humanity. Yeah. It's like, did I get my 10,000 steps? Did I manage my? Yeah, it's very inward looking, and in that there's a darkness. There's so much of life. You know what the philosopher finds when they leave the cave? There's a life theme. It blossoms and it blooms outside the cave, but the people in the cave are stuck in a particular narrative imposed by the powers that be. Today, the powers that be are not necessarily the lords and ladies, the aristocrats and the priests, but it is modern capitalism, right? So modern capitalism has said you can be, nobody quotes Bob Dylan anymore. Well, you can be, you can do what's never been done. You can be the one, right? You can solve all the social limitations and all, where it's individualism, a cancer in individualism, right? Individualism meant in the Enlightenment, you had individual legal freedoms like freedom of speech, right? And then later, after the French and American Revolution, you not if you are not a straight white man, but you could vote for who you want. That's what individual, the philosophers brought upon individualism in this world, like through the Enlightenment, to give you the basic rights enshrined in most democratic constitutions. The marketers took this to mean that you can be the greatest person that ever lived. You can have this amazing life. Yeah. And what that does is it stops you focusing on, the social structures of oppression and all. Today, the cave is when in the cave, the marionette, the marionettes and the shadows on the cave, it's basically it's a mirror. Okay, all the so I would never ever, try to amend Plato's game, but all I will say is the modern one is not necessarily people, the powers that be, but it's just the individual obsessed with himself and herself, yeah, which then they fail to see anything beyond and bigger, yeah. So that solipsism is a good antidote to that, is the concept, in the title of your book, Sonder, which is and then the next level to that is not only is everyone the main character in their own stories, but there's so much more than me getting better and me becoming a billionaire. I obviously taught in a high school for a long time, and later, and this comes as one of the poems in Modern Heresy. It's like the heroes have changed, right? The heroes used to be the celebrities and the athletes. Now the heroes are the billionaires. So to give you an example of how this relates to the cave, when you tell people, let's improve things, let's get the billionaires to pay higher taxes, and when you say structural things to modern man, obviously not everyone, they're like, why? Because why should you improve the station you're not going to be long at? Yeah. So when you come out, when the philosopher leaves the cave today and comes back in, one of the things I want to tell them is this, this solipsism, which is like, and this focus on, I wouldn't call it narcissism because there's another, narcissism means something else psychologically, and that's the common word used for it. But, so much of life and there's so limited self improvement you can do, and that's not profitable for businesses because there's really nothing you can sell on an advert or an influencer they can't sell a product to you saying it open your mind. There's no product for that, but what they can sell you is this makes you better. It doesn't. You're going to get frustrated, yeah, and you're going to self monitor so much when it all fails, when you're not going to be the most beautiful, handsome, successful person on earth. Yeah. And that is the darkness of modernity, right? Which is misinterpreted as everyone's a narcissist now, or whatever. Is narcissistic. It's not that. They have not been taught about the broader, there's so much in this world. Yeah, they've been taught about live your best life. But then you know what Aristotle said, right? A man can only be as happy as a man can be. So these guys are like, why am I not happy? Hey, how can I get better? After a while, there's a limit to which you can get better. We must get better. And that will give you the capaciousness, the space for you to have a
And
flourishing life.
speaking
Yeah.
of speaking of
So,
actually leaving
yeah.
the cave, of course, to a high degree, I do agree that the cave in the modern context sort of represents individuals obsessed with self improvement and themselves, and how the shadows now represent this sort of invisible hand played by corporations, and the masses are, as represented by the allegory, are somewhat blind to the puppeteers. And not to sound like one of those red pill podcasters that talk about escaping the matrix, but I feel like actually leaving the cave
Yeah.
somewhat symbolizes being metacognitive about your surroundings. It's not necessarily escaping society's constructs, but rather questioning it, questioning the invisible hand that controls the world. And once you start to sort of question your reality and find ways to understand it, and of course Plato calls it enlightenment with regard to the allegory of the cave. So once enlightened, your experiences and emotional awareness as a person prohibits you from returning to the former way of life or social structures that were blissfully ignorant of and you were happy to just follow. And I feel like that expunges you permanently from the very people that you were once a part of. it's almost like the more you experience, the more you question, the more contrarian you want to become, and practice this metacognitive life where you accept the philosophy that you could be wrong at any time and you should continue to question everything in life. You alienate yourself from the rest of the pack that is happy to live in ignorant bliss. And again, I don't know why, but there's this particular Anthony Bourdain quote that always comes back to me when I look at pictures of the cave. And I'm paraphrasing here and combining a couple of quotes too. But the actual Anthony Bourdain quote is, if I'm an advocate for anything, it's to move as far as you can, as much as you can, across the ocean or simply across the river. The extent to which you can walk in someone else's shoe or at least eat their food is a plus for everybody. Open your mind, get up off the couch, move. And as you move through this life and the world, you change things slightly. You leave marks behind, however small. And in return, life and travel leaves marks on you. Most of the time, those marks on your body or on your heart are beautiful. Often, though, they hurt. And this quote feels so perfect for the allegory of the cave and the actual art of leaving that cave. But it almost fits perfectly where the more you're exposed to the more you start to question the reality around you, open your eyes up to empathize and question. And that, although as much as it opens your eyes to the world, it isolates you from the life you used to have, and it becomes very difficult to go back to that life. And this is something I experienced once going to college and engaging in all of these different multicultural activities, experiencing different cultures, different people, the way they think. And coming back to Sri Lanka almost felt nightmarish. It was very hard to adjust. And it wasn't just me, it was a lot of my friends too.
I can imagine that.
To have your eye opened and your mind broadened to the whole world, and then to come back and live in a bubble with an expectation to revert back to your old ways of living and thinking just felt almost torturous. And this was something that primarily writing Sonder, but also one of the more startling realizations with life that I had to compete with, which was that the more I expose myself to, it becomes even harder to return back to any former way of life.
Yeah, I mean, like basically, if you've seen this world, and if, I don't mean even like going to different countries, and I don't mean it even in a physical sense, but like if you open your mind, you're not getting back into that cave voluntarily, time, shackling yourself and just looking at those empty shadows on the wall of the cave. Yeah. So that is a challenge, because Plato identified that, right? Like the philosopher is a lonely person. Right? The philosopher is not going to find much commonality, common ground with the average person. That is just not something that is going to happen. And as you said, that red pill, blue pill thing is like very, very hackneyed now. Yeah. But it's true, right? Like once you leave that matrix, even if you haven't left it, once you see that this is the matrix, you can't be the same person again. And that's just something that you have to accept, right? Like, there was he's a psychologist, but I just found this insight of his so seminal and, almost life changing. Kazimierz Dabrowski, a Polish psychologist, basically, he talks about positive disintegration. So I think in your case, what has happened is, and I love his terminology, because disintegration here means that you no longer can abide by the prevailing value system. Yeah. And why he uses positive is also very telling, because disintegration generally carries negative connotations, right? Like you never say disintegration in a positive, well, mostly not in a positive light, right? The economy disintegrated is not a thing that people say, in a positive light. But so positive disintegration is when the fact that you have understood the meaninglessness and the banality and often the cruelty of the prevailing value system. There are those, and he called it developmental potential, okay, or DP. But what he said was that those who can understand that, and if you can understand that, that is actually a fork in the road, because some at that stage double down on the value system. and you're at a particular age in your life, which this is going to happen, because when I went to school, and I'm sure when you went to school, or if you see the younger kids, they are open minded and they openly laugh at the absurdity. This goes back to existentialism, Albert Camus, right? The prevailing value systems in any culture are absolutely absurd oftentimes. Not in every aspect, but a lot of them. Okay, so positive disintegration is when, when you have this existential moment of fork in the road. According to Dabrowski, now he's a psychologist, so he's not exhorting people to go either way. He's just commenting on, because most people double down on the value system, and then they have to, fight cognitive dissonance for the rest of their life and rationalize how their choices are exactly the right choices. But some experience positive disintegration, where they say that value system is absurd and I am going to live a life that value honors the values of man, which I happen to think are universal values, though many disagree. Because right now the zeitgeist is at a moment where they say, yeah, okay, fine. If you want to abandon the prevailing value system, you have to look within and you have to create it on your own. Whereas I happen to believe that there is a set of values, progressive and enlightened, which are that of the next stage of humanity. But modernity doesn't agree. It just says you do you. Okay, or you go girl, which asks you to look in. But I feel that there is a like, and I'm not going to just speak philosophically, and and things like this, right? Basically, free play, frolic, humor, romance, okay, adventure, yeah, and creativity, imagination. Those I feel constitute a universal and timeless value system that no culture can afford to, or can thus far in human history could be able to afford to actualize, because it's just not economically feasible. The next stage of humanity, that value system will, if we get to the next stage of humanity, which is a huge doubt because the planet might not exist. And World War III may set us back. But from this late stage of capitalism, that would be progress. Yeah. And I actually can sort of like paint a day in that life. Maybe this is not the relevant time to do it. Where, instead of talking about these high flown things that certain philosophers and writers talk about without filling in the details, I can actually sort of granularly outline that life. Yeah. So yeah, it's one of those things where you can't expect culture to help you there. In this moment, in the fork in the road you're at, yeah, you can't expect, you can expect to, if you see the absurdity, you have a choice. Majority of people go, double down on their values when they have some doubt. It's only a very few who can withstand that angst and that tear, that cataclysmic tear in their psyche and their world, and then move to a new way of living, which has to be, as all cultures now, whether it's in the developed world or developing world, a culture. Yeah. So it is a huge challenge. And I guess the closest, I mean, utopia is not a thing because it means nowhere in Greek. But progress would mean the system helps you in that. But we are nowhere. Yeah. The system ain't going to help you, whether you're in a developed country or back in Sri Lanka or, a developing country. The system's not going to tell you have a life full of adventure and romance and humor and creativity and imagination and free play and frolic. Yeah. Yeah. And all you have to do is pay for that life in whichever way you can. And capitalism's purpose is only to pay for that life. Or the economic system, whichever, is to only pay for that life. Yeah. And what your duties are to not to prevent the opportunities for that life for others. To the limits of freedom are the toes of others, right? In you living that life, your moral duty is not to stop others from living that life as an expense of what you're doing. But that is obviously humanity is still in its infantile stages, and we are way beyond that. Like, how many parents, and I understand, how many parents can look at their kid and say, look, you live your life, you have a great adventure here. Because that kind of thinking runs against the prevailing economic necessity, the economic demands. So it's back to Karl Marx, right? Not exactly Mr. Popularity in philosophy schools, philosophy courses, or culturally now, but basically, history begins when man seeks to rest, living from nature. So we are still in that stage, right? Our worries are: can we get our incomes up? Can we pay that? Can we pay our mortgage? It's very materialistic concerns, which is very sad because uh, collectively we should have been beyond that right now. Yeah, but we're not. Yeah,
It is.
so it
It's
is a
very
challenge.
interesting that you mention this sort of disintegration and the reluctance to disintegrate from a philosophical standpoint. Because when I was sort of introduced to this problem, I approached it from
Hmm.
from the other end, which was psychology, and the concept is called learned helplessness. And this was,
Yeah, yeah.
yes,
Martin
Martin
Seligman,
Seligman.
right?
When people feel that they have no control over their lives, they become acclimatized to difficult or stagnant situations, right? They start to develop a pattern of avoidance, preferring to remain in unfavorable states rather than
Right.
to escape it. For example, if you break your arm, you immediately go to the hospital, you fix it, you heal. But if you have this sort of
Hmm.
dull,
Yeah.
nagging pain in your shoulder that doesn't quite go away, you'll
Hmm.
live with it for years. And that the injury that's not necessarily bad enough to be unbearable actually gets resolved faster than the one that's
Oh,
just tolerable enough to ignore. And I think that,
absolutely,
yeah, and
absolutely.
I think that maps onto
And that's what
almost
keeps people in place, right? They're eating. That's what keeps people in place. They're actually
exactly.
eating. They have a
I
roof
mean,
over their head.
and I think
So why
exactly.
move? Why
I feel like the
change?
brain just chooses the path of least resistance, and
Yeah, that's
and
pre-programmed, right,
we
by
don't
nature.
like as humans we don't get stuck in bad situations. We get stuck in okay ones. You know, the ones that we can tolerate,
Mm.
and the ones that are uncomfortable enough to quietly drain the life out of you, but
Yeah,
not
exactly.
uncomfortable
So
enough.
this is the frog in boiling water
Yeah,
problem, right? If you chuck a frog into boiling water, obviously the frog leaps out. But if you increase the temperature 1 degree every minute, I suppose, um, the frog boils to death nevertheless. But in none of those minutes until the very end has any incentive to leave, right? So modern life, as you said earlier, right? I was like quite, it was quite an amazing thing that you said that we live better than monarchs did 100 years ago. The average middle class person, I mean, could a monarch 100 years ago tap a few buttons on a rectangle and get any type of food they wanted delivered to their doorstep? Like they could in terms of their kitchen, okay, fine. But then could they move in these ultra sophisticated vehicles that know your probably your heart rate and your perfect temperature? They couldn't because those things didn't exist. Could they communicate with pretty much anyone on earth, instantaneously? Yeah. So we do live in that better thing. So then, as you said, the incentive to leave that is drained, isn't it? Why? Because the body is comfortable, but the mind is suffering. Yeah, because we are living in a way that doesn't optimize either the um, evolutionary past, whereas we used to live actually very social lives. Yeah? And in developing countries, fortunately, still do live social lives, and we live over social lives. Aunties and uncles are always in your face in your life choices and well. Whereas, so what we have is a problem of developing countries being over socialized and developed countries being under socialized, and there's a loneliness. Yeah, so it's diabolical. I think that's the word I'll use. Yeah, because if you really want to torture a person, you'd keep the prison door open, yeah, and ask them. They can leave at any time, but they themselves don't want to leave because it's a bad material bargain or it's a bad bargain, so they persist in their torture. Then they don't blame you. They
there's
have to blame
actually a name for
themselves.
this.
Yeah.
This middle ground where people sort of
Yeah.
can tolerate the level of suffering, so they continue to suffer, and it's called a suboptimal equilibrium. And it's
Yeah. It is a suboptimal
and
equilibrium.
it's
I call it the Hotel California problem. You can check out anytime, but you
Right.
can never leave. Yeah. So if you are free to do anything, you're free. Think about modern life, right? You're free to leave. You're free to quit your job. Free to leave all these material
And
comforts. But can
I
you?
feel like
That's a challenge.
modern society has made this problem worse by solving the survival problem. Like you said, we're comfortable enough, we're fed enough, we're
Yeah.
entertained enough, and that baseline of
Yeah.
comfort is precisely what keeps all of us stagnant. Like,
Yeah.
collectively, we've somehow stopped being willing to suffer today for a better tomorrow. And instead, we've quietly settled for this mainstream mediocrity where we're not miserable enough to revolt, but not fulfilled enough to actually be living. And the psychology behind this
That's
is,
why slavery won't
yeah.
last. Yeah, that's the problem with straight up slavery because it's so abject and miserable that the slaves want to revolt. So the more advanced system is to keep the slaves
And to be fair, the
enslaved but
psychology behind
comfortable.
this is it's pretty dark because your brain isn't passively letting this happen. It's actively constructing a cage for yourself. Learned helplessness research, it shows that when people feel that they have no control, they stop trying entirely. They don't escape. They
Right?
just complain and adapt to the pain. Then layer on status quo bias and this deep wired preference to keep things as they are gets turbocharged by luxury traps and perpetuating the hedonic treadmill. Because as you accumulate comfort and wealth and status symbols, you sort of start to adapt to them so fast that yesterday's luxury become today's baseline necessity, and now you're just working relentlessly just to maintain a life that doesn't necessarily make you happy. And then you start to rationalize the whole thing because the alternative is to lose all the validation that you've accumulated over the years. You disrupt your routine, you take the path of resistance, and that feeling is probably worse in the short run than attempting to escape. And that rationalization, I feel, connects directly to Plato's cave, where the prisoners don't necessarily want to leave. They've mistaken shadows for reality, and the questioning that reality means alienation, discomfort, and the terrifying prospect of being wrong about everything, that sort of difficulty is probably what causes people to double down on their values, like you said, where they defend it vigorously. And even though people know they should change, they don't necessarily act. And your brain psychologically resolves this tension through illusion, where you repeat a justification to yourself enough times internally, you start to actually believe it. And this is true in any case. When the line between a story you're telling yourself and the truth becomes indistinguishable because you've repeated the fallacy to yourself so many times that now you're stuck in the cage that you've created for yourself in your mind, and it now your baseline, it's now your home.
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting thing because those days the propaganda came from external sources. Yeah, the aristocrats and the priests. Yeah, the king and the clergy. Yeah, but now this is, I struggle to pronounce this guy's name. Byung Hul Chan, South Korean born but German philosopher. And I think other than all this rubbish spewed by Slavoj Žižek and all rubbish, this is just too, these are charlatan, this is just, but this guy, not very well known, but what he talks about is the exhortations now. This is such an important point. Like, if this is all everyone takes away from this, I would say this is a huge success, at least from my perspective. The exhortations now come from within, yeah. Whereas earlier it was from without. It was from external sources saying you should do this, yeah. Now it's your own inner voice saying I should do this, and that is a humongous change in human history. That is such a monumental and pivotal change. Whereas earlier, yeah, the church, whatever religious authority and the king and religion told you this is why and this is what you should do. Now it's within you. So earlier, when you didn't do what you were supposed to, you let an external power down. But now it's almost arguably worse. You're letting yourself down. And that is a root cause of depression and anxiety, right? When we got rid of God from his throne, I'm an atheist, so I would say, unfortunately, I don't believe in God. But I'm not one of those virulent fundamentalist atheists who tries to convert others because I don't want to take away their bliss. But remember, right now, when you don't do live the successful life, you're letting yourself down, and that often is much harder than letting an external power down. Right? Think about it. When you don't do what you're supposed to, when you don't do well in college, when you don't do your 10,000 steps, go to the gym, tick every box, eat healthy, yeah, it's you, and that's hard. Yeah, okay. It's so interesting that you wrote a book called Sonder in a world which is often, as I said, misdiagnosed as narcissism, but it's solipsism. Yeah, it's too much of pressure to live this good, live this. Yeah, there's a poem in modern heresy called prophetishism. Yeah, the perfectionism that is demanded and the pressure on the individual has never been higher. Has never been higher than in human history.
At one point, I started to question why. Well, this was in the book. I started to question why I have these standards for myself. What is the origin of these desires? And in my search for that is where I came across Rene Girard's mimetic theory. And this is hands down one of my favorite theories I've ever come across. It's something I write about quite often. And excuse me if I go on a bit of a tangent explaining what this is, but it's going to connect into scapegoatism, and I feel like you can contribute quite a lot towards that. So, what mimetic theory basically is that desire isn't necessarily inherent, but it's mimicked. And so, what Rene Girard argues is that desire is not innate; it's learned by observing and imitating others. So we borrow our desires from models. When I say models, I mean peers, celebrities, role models, and they dictate what we think we want, like fast fashion, lifestyle, political ideology. And what mimetic desire creates is mimetic rivalry and scapegoating. And it's because we imitate what others desire, it inevitably creates competition and rivalry for the same object. And when this tension within a group boils over, society unconsciously unites together to expel or blame a scapegoat to relieve the tension and restore order. So let's play this out in the real world. And the core insight is a little simple but quite devastating. So when we don't actually know what we want, we look at other people, we copy their desires, and then we convince ourselves that those desires were ours all along. And Girard called it mimesis, or imitation. And we are fundamentally imitative creatures. And the problem is when everyone's copying everyone else's desire, you get an incredible buildup of envy, resentment, and that rivalry needs to go somewhere. So Girard's second idea, the scapegoat mechanism, is where it gets really relevant today. I could use it to explain basic examples like social media, relationship, and that theory applies to basic social interactions. But when you apply it to society as a whole, it puts pressure on your whole community. And when that tension gets unbearable, communities don't fix underlying problems. They don't fix systems. That's too hard, too slow. It's ambiguous. It's unglamorous. But instead, society tends to find targets. They load collective anxiety and resentment onto one figure and symbolically destroy it. And that's what we call cancel culture now. And this,
on a note which is different from yours, but this cancel culture and woke, this is ridiculous. This is so anti-intellectual. Like basically, that's I think a talk for another day. But I totally agree with you on the like with Rene Girard. What I find is that his initial insight, it's there's an irony in that, in the sense that it's so obvious. Like everyone, if they prod them enough with, since this is philosophical sort of a podcast, the Socratic method, if you prod them enough, anyone would finally tell you where they learned their desires is from other people. Yeah. So what I take away from this is it goes back to what I said earlier at the very beginning. This age is no better intellectually than any age which preceded it. If at all I want to see what's better in this age than previously, I suppose the anti-racism embedded in the culture. Basically, in developed countries, the official position of culture is racism is bad and more gender equality. Of course, racism persists and women are not equal, but at least that's the official position. But beyond that, intellectually, now I've deducted all of the technological advancements, some of which I don't consider advancements, and the material compass. Beyond that, this is not intellectually a better age. This is not progress. What we have called progress is very different from the Enlightenment view of progress. Progress has been commandeered by capitalism. What we are talking about is there's more gadgets, yeah, and there's more creature comforts. But this is not intellectually superior beyond that egalitarian ideal which has now come, and I'm so happy that it has come to preside over the culture. Now, the woke have taken it to absurd and self-defeating extremes. But we should all be grateful to the Enlightenment for this egalitarianism, which is now being corrupted and perverted by wokeism and before that political correctness. But beyond that, I don't find any. We look in human history. People used to copy the desires of others. We still do, and that often leads to unfulfilled life, at least objectively speaking. Because if you ask the subject, Vipulesh, they'll be like, "Yeah, I'm having a great life," because they have to say that. But this is why I don't look up to this age beyond those two things I mentioned as progress. If you basically you load gadgets and comforts onto medieval and dark age folk, right? That's it. Yeah. Whereas in this stage of humanity, too optimistically, what we hoped for was a different kind of human psyche, right? A different kind of human psyche. And that hasn't come to pass. I will only declare it progress. I will only consider it progress when a different human psyche comes about. Yeah. And I'll tell you one aspect of that different psyche. It comes in this poem called Sharing Economy in Modern Heresy, right? What a better world it would be. I'm not talking about the corp, so don't think in the perspective of your boss or the corporation. If we all worked part time, what is now called part time, you create a job for someone else, right? When you work 25 hours a week, you get it? And the logic of that is the human psyche has moved away from the evolutionary obsession with materialism. Yeah. You know why evolution programmed us to, be so greedy in terms of food and other material goods? Because it was so hard to find them. And from a sort of like an eagle eye view on today, it's so pathetic and it's so sad that we are still so obsessed with stuff when feeding ourselves in safety is, in the developed world at least, much, much, much easier now, right? So, as you said, we are still imitating desires. In this case, they are coming from advertisements earlier, and now influencers and so on. We are still in Rene Girard's, insight is, I wouldn't even call it an insight because it's very obvious that man copies man. But what that does, bringing that up in the discussion shows is don't consider ourselves more progressive and advanced than the before us, like, parents who are racist and misogynistic and all. Yes, we've eliminated those, just claim credit for those two things, if at all that you practice them. And psyche is still just like career plans and, 401ks and how I can grow my. But ideally, as a society, look at Star Trek. Okay, in Star Trek, there is no private property. It's not shoved in your face. But we should have moved to a better life where, look, John Maynard Keynes in, I think, 1920 said that the work week was going to be like 15 hours. That hasn't come to pass. It's the opposite. You are paid for 40, but you've got to put in 75 just to make it nowadays, right? Just to survive. So we have okay, you're right. We have copied desires, but I just want you to tell me whose desires have we copied? We earlier copied the desires of the powers that be, the king and the church. Whose desires are we copying? We are copying. But I want some insight, from you as a young man to tell me who do you copy your desires from? What do you press Control C on? Or what are you pushed to press Control C on? I want the
Right.
provenance of
And
those
when it does
desires.
come to identifying where these desires come from, I think a lot of them are environmental. And of course, that's different based on where exactly you live, how much technology you're exposed to, your degree of connectivity with other people. Because the wider your social web, the more you have to mimic, right? And the more isolated or insular you may be, the less you have to mimic. And I guess this relates to that saying that the billionaire is more depressed than the fisherman, because the fisherman's whole world is simply just his village where he goes to fish, hangs out with his family, and goes to the local bar to hang out with his friends. But the billionaire has the whole world to look at and everything in the world to desire, and no matter how much you acquire, there isn't necessarily enough. And I'll get to that, which I've sort of scheduled for later in the episode. But I feel like this actual mimicry extends to how far your connectivity to the world extends and how big your community is.
So you're saying like basically a person in a country like Sri Lanka, well, not, I guess everyone, people are connected here as well, but like there's more potential for them to mimic. I'll operationalize it because otherwise it just becomes very abstract for the listener. But basically, the pressure more for most people here is to like mimic, like have that huge brown wedding, yeah, because yeah, everyone else is having it. Well, your friend had it, your neighbor had it, 1,000
Yeah,
people,
insane.
ungodly and exorbitant
You know,
amount of money
I
spent. Yeah,
discovered very recently that banks underwrite wedding parties in Sri Lanka, and it makes no sense. Where is the rationale?
wait till you see that happens in
Where is
India,
the risk
man. People
assessment?
go into generational
Yeah,
debts for weddings
when
in
I
India.
learned that people take loans out to get married, it stunned me.
Oh yeah.
Because
Big
how
time.
are you going to
So you're
repay that
saying
loan?
that basically you don't, and then you get in a lot of trouble. You have this like poetry life struggling to pay for what 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. Okay, so yeah, you're saying that here maybe the model, using the terminology of Gerard, is to copy. I guess because the exposure is less to copy, yeah, but there it's more like a globalist, like a global outlook. Yeah, but either way, the whole. I mean, there's nothing wrong with imitation and emulation. Obviously, I mean, this is sort of like a logical point as long as you're imitating something optimal for you. But I don't see any optimal
Right. Yes.
paradigms out there. Like I don't see any optimal paradigms that are not just this like weird, and I though despite the gray beard, I wasn't alive then. I can see from a historical lens more optimal look. Basically, I'm very disappointed with the project of the 60s failed so suddenly. Like I don't, there were alternative lifestyles then, like communes and everything. The 60s, when the story of this chapter in humanity is written, I know that the 1960s and the counterculture movement will be perhaps but a footnote. Yeah, and I'm very sad for that fact. But I feel that the another thing to learn than the particular values is the fact that there was this movement to push alternative lifestyles and challenge the mainstream, and I don't see that. What
So
challenges
here's
the
where I think
mainstream now?
you have something that's actually going very right here, because, and going back to Gerard here, his whole point was that when these desires are mimicked, they're not necessarily the right desires to be mimicking. And because that tension boils over, you end up scapegoating and not resolving a serious problem that you already have. And let me give you an example, because this does sound pretty abstract, and I'll borrow from the Americans right now. Let's look at the wealth inequality debate, right? Obviously, all Americans are for solving wealth inequality. And the actual problem is very much structural. It's hollowed out middle classes, it's housing markets that are completely broken, healthcare systems that extract wealth, and educational debt that pretty much is a generational poverty trap. Because don't even get me started on student
Yeah.
loans. But there are real serious, complex problems with solving the wealth inequality, and everyone mimics this desire for wealth equality. But the solution is very complex, it's unglamorous, it's slow, it requires multi decades of policy work. There's no clear villain or clear narrative, but there's clear mimetic desire and clear rivalry there. But you can't necessarily sell the multi-generational policy reform to voters. So instead, they point to billionaires who are the scapegoats in this situation. So instead of solving the problems, which is the healthcare or the student loan system, or how do we help the middle class, it's instead tax him, tax Elon Musk, eat the rich. And I want to be clear, I'm not defending billionaires. It's not Gerard's point and it's not mine. And I can acknowledge that these problems have nuanced arguments and we don't have to dwell in the technicalities. But the principle on a basic level of the dynamic is that because of the mimetic tension and all that envy and resentment cycling through society, it gets discharged in a ritual. And as a crowd, we unify for reform and just sacrifice someone. Everyone feels righteous. Everyone feels like we've somehow received justice, but structurally, almost nothing changes, almost nothing evolves. And we've just gone back to the beginning until we find a different scapegoat to sacrifice again and again instead of solving our own problems.
So basically, what you're saying is we're just hanging Louis the 14th. Yeah, and this is one thing I want to focus on. Like, obviously people are suffering and there's inflation and all of those things in America and other countries. But like, I just want to focus on the fact that, yeah, I mean, the scapegoating thing is kind of people's fault. Like, I'm for taxing billionaire. I'm for not having billionaires. So I just say that right up, and I'm for there shouldn't be billionaires. But like from another perspective, and this is very unpopular, right? But I'm gonna say it anyway. It's kind of people's fault, right? Like in the sense that I can excuse those who haven't had the exposure and education. This is why either it's people's fault or education is a failure. And I would say education's a failure and that's why it's people's fault. Because basically people, they abide by this system, maybe mimetic desire, not maybe, definitely because of mimetic desire. But when it goes wrong, I don't know what Gerard said on this particularly. It's when it goes wrong, they pick scapegoats. And that is exactly the configuration, and that is exactly how it has always worked in human history. Look at Rome. These guys were, in the Colosseum watching, gladiators kill lions or whatever for 180 days of the year, half the year, right? And then, it was called the policy of bread and circuses. Yeah. It's like when you click that button to watch the Kardashians and when you glorify the billionaires whom you later blame, it's kind of your fault, which was totally excusable in ancient Rome because of the education. The masses had none. But now, since average person nowadays feels they know stuff and has this confidence to speak out, when they are as miseducated as almost, other than literacy and numeracy, as we've ever been. Like beyond the veneer of education, I have a high school diploma degree. People just don't know what's going on, and they, in that ignorance, in that darkness, they mimic. Yeah, and that mimicry leads to disaster, and then they blame. So that's like sort of like explicating the logical chain how it gets here. Like I'm sure that you can't expect Gerard, who was writing a book generally on this. But now how it works is this. You're an educated dumbass who's got a college diploma. Yeah. I mean, I don't mean you because you're here talking about these issues, right? You think you're smart, okay? You think you know stuff. You think you're going to act differently. You purchase the same things. You go by this system. And then when it all goes to hell, then that's human nature to start blaming people. But in the meanwhile, until recently, until Musk hitched his wagon to Trump and then unhitched it, I remember I used to have debates with kids in class, smart kids, who thought that he was this great revolutionary, he was the reincarnation of Steve Jobs. Yet, so people buy into this, uncritically buy into this. And that's when the insight of Gerard, and I think it's a very obvious thing that people, yeah. So, sort of like adding to that, how this works. You buy, it's like it's like we love to hate celebrities as well, and then we love them, we worship them. And when things go wrong, we blame them disproportionately to their quantum of blame. They have something to do with this, but this is all if modern man accepts as they, shout, I'm educated, I know stuff. Then
Exactly.
why are you
There's
doing this
actually a
stupid
name
stuff?
for this.
Yeah.
It's called the Gellman amnesia effect, if you've heard of it. The Gellman amnesia effect.
What? I love
So
that.
the principle
The gentleman.
the
Okay, tell
principle
us.
is if you open a newspaper and say you're an engineer by trade, while going through the newspaper you come across the science section and you criticize certain things, you evaluate the veracity of the science and technology pages. But that same scientist, when they go to the politics section or the humanities section, don't necessarily have that expertise to question the information that they're consuming. So they absorb it like a
Mm.
sponge. And the problem is when you throw children into social media at 13 years where they have expertise in, well, nothing, they tend to just absorb information from any source like a sponge. And that eventually just boils into this mess, just information of misinformation for just years pumped into people. And this is not just children, but octogenarians and
Yeah,
adults
anybody.
who consume Facebook content without.
I think they're more guilty of this than
Yeah,
kids. When your auntie sends you conspiracy
yeah,
memes, it's like, this is my point. Can we at least agree, as in, modern man thinks he's way more
100%.
smarter than he is. I think the saying that I keep coming back to, and it appears in my book, like I put it obviously in quotes. I don't know who said it first, but a little learning is a dangerous thing. What the formal education has done and what culture has done is given people more confidence in their thoughts as opposed to improve the logical rigor of their thoughts. Yeah. That's a very different thing. To think you're smart and then to help you improve the rigorousness of your argumentation in your own head. It doesn't have to be in a public forum, because look, a lot of people are not going to speak up on CNN town square. Yeah, the rigor of their logical argumentation in their own head may have improved. I'm not going to say it's the same as in the dark ages. It is far less than what they think it has. And this goes back to Plato, not the cave, well, kind of the cave, where he had a very low view on the intellect of the masses and democracy. And that's why he's not exactly the most popular philosopher, because, I would say like it's improved, what, 10, 20, 30% from whenever the benighted ages, but it hasn't improved as much as people think it is, because America elected Donald Trump twice. And the things that people think, if you examine, if you unearth, if you unpack the logical, argumentation, it's non sequitur, man. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I feel
it's
like
like,
I
there's a bearded guy up there, was what we believe for 1,000, for 10,000 years since civilization began. Not 10,000 years, but monotheism 2,500 years, let's say two. Yeah, but the the fact that God has been upseated and man, but these guys are not thinking smart things. They're not thinking in smart ways, right? So yeah, I have little respect for that. What I feel has happened was that science has moved very far, much, much faster than intellect. Yeah. A
fair enough.
few very, very smart people, research have brought us the technology with which we are talking today. The masses have, in their jobs, have to do a task which is so broken down for them that science has been taken by corporations, then they hire you to do a very limited task. Yeah. And formal education has given you the confidence of a thinker or a philosopher. But the average person, even in the developed world, and in America especially, hasn't moved so far to usher in the next stage of man. I don't think
I
that has
feel like
happened.
these corporations rushing to control narratives. I don't know if you know, but certain news publications are now owned by billionaires. And I mean, social media algorithm is pretty much used as a tool to reinforce what someone already believes. And is just a constant perpetuating cycle of self-assurance. I feel like this misinformation cycle has gotten pretty prevalent recently.
Basically, the last time that philosophers had a say in what is a good life, which is so ironic because philosophy is the search for a good life. Yeah. That, if you say philosophy began in ancient Greece, it's very different from what philosophers in academia do now, right? They're basically bullshit detectors who write papers for other philosophers now. That has nothing to do with influencing the masses. There's nothing called public philosophy anymore. And the last public philosopher is the utter charlatan, as I said, Zizek. Okay, it makes no sense. He's the kind of people who Plato tried to get rid of from Athens. Yeah. So basically, the last time that philosophy had a say in how the world, your life, was hundreds of years ago, right? In the Enlightenment, like basically since the 50s, who has a say? Okay, you tell me, who comes up, who writes the story of, who writes the model of what is a good life today? I'm interested to know from a young man.
I mean, fair
Who?
enough. I didn't necessarily have this model of what exactly happiness is and what a good life is, which is why I had to write my own book. But I think from me trying to identify where my desires come from, it led me to a path of trying to identify what exactly would create a satisfying and happy life. And that was where I had gone from trying to identify where my desires came from. And that led me to Professor Arthur C. Brooks. He's quite popular nowadays. A lot of books he teaches at Harvard. And he basically has this equation where your satisfaction with life is equal to what you have divided by what you want. And his explanation is that as humans have solved the problem for basic necessities, we've supposed to focus obsessively on our wants, and having things to want continually supersedes things you have. And this goal is, and we've set the goal paradoxically, whereas the goal is not necessarily to increase the numerator, which is what you have, but actively reduce the denominator, which is what you want, to achieve some kind of balance and homeostasis, right?
I just feel like, this whole pursuit of happiness, like he's alive still, I think. It's mostly the philosophies we, as you said, quoted many living ones, but like Pascal Bruckner on the pursuit of happiness. Why is happiness our goal? How the hell did that become our goal? That's a question as well. It's impossible to feel good. Like I have this whole huge talk on happiness. I'm not going to get into the entire thing now because it will take forever. But like what I can say is like, Aristotle, right? Eudaimonia. Why are we seeking to be happy? Also, that is the recipe for ultimate unhappiness. Because you're going to self-monitor yourself. The marketers are going to make it a good feeling, right? But what Pascal Bruckner says in On the Pursuit of Happiness, yeah, is like this is a very modern post World War II corporate invention that you can always be happy, because if you look at the hedonic treadmill, as you said, anything's gonna habituate, right? I think humans would be much better served if this is why there's a poem in Modern Heresy called Happyless, okay, and in that poem it basically says don't ever use the word happiness. Now obviously to say this I have to use the word happiness, but this is more like a philosophical thing, but we should replace happiness with meaning. Yeah. Because you're never going to be happy all the time. Your own brain chemistry is going to find that. This is what people hooked on drugs are going to find, right? Like whatever the high is, it's going to habituate and it's going to be meh. And you're only going to be taking the substance to not feel miserable, not to feel happy. Happiness it's a bonus, right? When you do the things you want to do, right, you may find it, and that feels much better than seeking it, because when you aggrandize it in your mind so much that when you achieve it, it's going to be underwhelming. So this is a very, according to Pascal, and I totally agree, I nearly plagiarized his thought on this, his comment on this. Is such an American. Like, it says it in the Constitution, but in a very different way. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what the marketers have made it, who are the new priests? Let's admit it. Marketers are the new clergy. Now they have a particular garb in terms of influencers, and it's on YouTube, but since, post World War II, it's just like you should be happy. So what he says is, so it's like the fact that you're not always in perpetual euphoria is a source of unhappiness because you're always self-monitoring. Why am I not happy? Why am I
I
a
completely
better?
agree with you because I think people see happiness as this state of life and it's somehow the mark of a high quality or standard of living. And of course not, because to me, happiness more or less is like a sensation, like hunger or
Exactly.
pain. It's supposed to
It's
heighten and
fleeting.
subside as you go through life. But what I think is a more proper metric of a life well lived and purpose found is how satisfied one is with their way of life. It doesn't necessarily have to.
And a cause to which how satisfied can only be delivered by having a meaning and not a meaning dictated by, as this is getting back to Girard, which is just by the pursuit of material objects, which, if you dig down deeper, goes back to the euphoria thing.
Yes.
That's how the reason for the purchase of material objects beyond survival is a happiness, is a sensation. Yeah.
Yes.
So that meaning. And then the next question is, as you said, is where am I? What is meaning? Is it gonna be this culturally indoctrinated thing which I pursue, which when I look at the person next to me, they are also pursuing, which inevitably ends up in an economic end? Have you noticed? Every culture's meaning, right, in the end, especially in this late capitalist stage, will always end up in a materialistic thing. It may not start off as a, in pre in countries like Sri Lanka, which are not fully in late stage capitalism, I would say, though there are aspects of it. I would say the other thing, like other than the materialistic thing, it's the status thing here, right? Yeah, how can you outdo the Joneses or the Pereiras, I guess, here, right? And those are empty quests, right? Those are empty quests. Materialism and status, often which have a huge overlap because you use materialism to enhance status. But there's an emptiness in that. And in that emptiness, you find the depression, anxiety, and existential meaninglessness, and the nihilism that you see in certain people, certain communities, and certain countries, right? Like what ideally we should have done, though it's a little utopian, is to take care of the material, yeah, and to downplay status, and for each to pursue whatever burns their soul. And this is where that's so important that you brought that up. But it can't be something that you copy. The moment you copy it, I have to say, it's not the thing that burns your soul. It's the thing that has been burned into your soul. And those are very different things. Yeah.
And I'm actually smiling from ear to ear right now because partly because I feel like a good host because I've brought you to exactly the conclusion of my book and also the next part of the podcast. But this is actually exactly word to word sort of the resolution I got to in my book. And obviously me being somewhat obsessed with scientific case studies, in my book too, I refer to the Grant study in particular. And this is
Okay.
actually quite fascinating because Harvard basically ran a study 1930, I believe. It's the longest
Yeah.
scientific study on happiness ever conducted, right? They
Mm.
started tracking
Yeah.
around 700 guys, Harvard grads, but also teenagers
Yeah.
from like Boston's
In
poorest neighborhood.
Boston, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
in
in Boston.
like
Yeah, in South Boston and all with the Irish. Yeah,
and this was during the Great Depression too. And
yeah,
there were two completely opposite ends to the social spectrum, right? We had teenagers from Boston's poorest neighborhoods, but we also had Harvard grads, and among these Harvard recruits was John F. Kennedy. This was before he was even president. This was back in his uni days. And they tracked these men. They tracked them for decades. Multiple generations of researchers took over just to keep the study going, right? Blood samples, brain scans, surveys, interviews, painstakingly, meticulously conducted across 75 years of
mm,
wildly different parts. Some became doctors,
mm,
lawyers, businessmen, presidents, and others ended up as alcoholics or schizophrenic. And after
mm.
all of that research, after nearly a century of data, you want to know what the single clearest conclusion was?
I actually know that whole study, but I don't
Yeah.
know the
Let
conclusion.
me
So tell
let
me.
me let me finish the rant then. It wasn't wealth, like you said. It wasn't anything material. It wasn't fame. It wasn't IQ, genetics, or social class. The single biggest contributor to satisfaction and happiness in life, according to that study, was relationships. It was people's level of satisfaction with their relationship at age 50. And that was a better predictor of their physical health than their medical tests. And the people who were most connected, the people that were most loved and most embedded into genuine community, those were the people that lived the longest, the happiest and healthiest lives.
And that's been replicated. Yeah. So it's like that study they did in sort of a hospice care. So basically, you're going to die and everyone has accepted it. And like, they were like, what do you regret? And no one ever said, I didn't earn enough money. It's just like, I didn't spend enough time with the people I love. So, and this points to, this is what I like. Look, we talked about a lot of abstract and difficult material, but I would say what I can tell people is like, capitalism. I know this is very trite, this saying, it used to be at least. Capitalism is a good slave, but a bad master. Yeah. I think that today's religion is capitalism. Yeah. And it's been that way for a while. And just like with the blind faiths of the past, there's a lot to even the religious traditions, So I think that the fundamentalist atheists who may throw the baby out with the bathwater, I have some issue with them as well, even though I don't believe God exists. But I think people should take a little bit more skepticism, actually a lot more with the basically. There's no one church today, but it's all those, the voices of late stage capitalism, right? Like, this is not working. If you think all of what we talked about is like super abstract, wishy-washy, philosophical drivel, at least know this fact. We are killing the planet, right? And there's no happiness or a good life in a dead planet. So I think like the Enlightenment went up against the aristocracy and the church, there has to be a movement that legitimately goes up against late stage capitalism, which is not communism. Yeah. Because in America, we're just going to be labeled as, lefties who are gonna hate America and hate freedom and all those Republican propaganda and pernicious talking points. But like, basically, we need some kind of skeptical, critical dialogue, discourse. Discourse means it's in the mainstream, right? When you use that word, it's in the mainstream. That goes up against, that questions the church of today, the church of capitalism, late stage capitalism. And that doesn't mean this is an argument against free markets and free enterprise. That we've left that long ago, right? We've left that long ago, saying that what increases wealth, what increases income is free markets and enterprise. But now it's combined with a dogma and a propaganda, right? That, and what I find really sad is like all that revolutionary energy, all that rebellious critical energy, as I said earlier, is not turned toward the church of capitalism. It's now all that energy is turned toward you. Though this is getting more like psychological and more sort of like Freudian here, where all that energy is not turned against the forces, the hegemony that presides. It's turned against you. And that's the kind of self-hate that drives depression, right? In capitalism, since anyone can make it, Vipulesh, the ultimate question when you don't, there's no question when you don't make it. The scapegoat is you. Why didn't I make it? Why am I not rich? The blame in capitalism has to go, in late stage capitalism, in hegemonic capitalism, has to be, the fault lies not in your stars, it's in you. And that has to change, right? For people to live flourishing life. I'm not going to say happiness. I'm not going to say, because happiness has been co-opted, corrupted, adulterated, and, by zeitgeist, by culture, right? If you want to live a better life, you have to have that intellectual capability to question the hegemony that presides, right? Is this what you want? You work 12 years in school, okay, to make it to a good college. You work 4 years and maybe grad school. Then you get recruited by a big corporation. You get married. Okay, you're working so hard for things. You get alienated from your partner. Kids don't know who you are. You have no real relationship with your kids. You do this for 40 years, in the midst of which AI is probably going to take your job. You're under immense stress and you die in shady oaks, alone and miserable. And in the meantime, incomparably comfortable material life. As we said many times, more comfortable than lords and ladies of yesteryear, but at the same time empty. So you got to carry that intellectual skepticism and that critical faculty. You got to keep it in all the things you do, right? Like you're going to have a suburban two garage SUV and Merc, whatever, suburban, like basically American suburban houses, like mansions.
Right.
I mean, if you come from a country like Sri Lanka or even in Europe, investors, so capitalism has taught us to dedicate our life at its altar. So it's no different than a religion, right? Many thinkers and philosophers have said this, and with all religions, they are out to use you for their benefit. Yeah? And I don't think this is a conspiracy by billionaires or the Illuminati and all this rubbish. But it's as though it was. It's not. But if they design a conspiracy, we would be these same people. And that's the most perverse thing about it. Like if they sat around with hooded, in hooded robes and discussed, they would do that because they would make you buy into this. Yeah. There's a poem in modern heresy called Stretch Marks, and Marx is Karl Marx. Yeah. Basically, we should use this system until we are ready for socialism to say, look, this is a great thing. We eat more, we have more income than if we tried any other system. Capitalism is the best economic system in terms of income. It creates inequality, but so did feudalism and everything before it. Far worse than this. Not in the magnitude of inequality, but the wretchedness of the lives of the lowest was far more wretched than it is now. And then stop there. Don't stretch. That's it. The question for modern man, very practically and in very simple terms that anyone can understand, is what kind of a person are you when you clock out of your job? Now that you earned your bread, yeah, are you still gonna be under the hegemony of this system, which is gonna lead to misery for you, or are you gonna use the pennies that you earn to open your mind and live? Yeah, that is the question. The question is, okay, fine. I've done my 8 hours or whatever. I've earned, my living. But afterwards, really difficult, Vipulesh, to switch off from the. I mean, if you could switch off from a hegemony, does it become a hegemony anymore? That's right. It just becomes propaganda which you can tune out. So we must go to that stage. A lot of these problems we are buying in too much.
So
Yeah, Gerard would say humans have always bought in. Our question today is we have always bought in. Our question is what are we buying into today? How is it different from what we bought into previous? Yeah.
and my question would be, I mean, we have plenty of revolutionaries in 2026, right? We have the protesters, which are weirdly funded by billionaires. We have the philosophers that want this sort of
No, but we
intellectual
don't
revolution.
have philosophers now, Vipulesh. We don't
Yeah,
have intellectuals. They are in their ivory towers writing papers for publication and tenure,
right.
right? Can you name, okay, who is like the Voltaire of today? Okay,
Fair.
who are the philosophers out there today? And when Jean-Paul Sartre, okay, one of the key figures in existentialism, when he died, okay, part of it was because he was a playwright. There was 1 million people who marched after his funeral procession. Yeah, we don't have. I'm not saying philosophers should aim to be superstars and celebrities. We don't listen to that. Instead, what we have is Dr. Phil and Oprah, right? Utter sophistry, rubbish, trash. Self-help gurus who are adding an eighth step to their, 7 steps of being a successful. We don't have that. We are paying attention, right, as people are want to do to the wrong people. Yeah, I think even in previous ages there were some people like that. Few and far between, but this is an anti-philosophical
Right.
age. I don't think we should forget that. This is an anti-philosophical
So,
age.
do you not think that for a normal layperson to navigate through this complicated and intricate situation and time. Would environmental construction and simply being very conscious and metacognitive about their surrounding and maybe the 5 people they're closest to is the best that anyone.
No, look, the thing is, I'll tell you something. There has never been. This is the perversity of this. In previous times, the masses couldn't read Vipulesh, so therefore they had no chance. These people, they have gone to school, and many of them to college, and there's powered. I mean, enabled by the internet. All they have to do is read, but in the reading, they can't be looking at how the top hit on the Google search or TikTok, or because those are there for commercial reasons. Yeah, that's part of the capitalistic hegemony. But there's plenty because they don't even care. It's like Jesus in Roman times. There were many such preachers like him, and people didn't. The Romans didn't care because they were so marginal that no one listened to them. Yeah. So there, all the material is there for the average person. The question is, are they going to be moved with the current towards the self-help quacks, or are they going to do the harder work to listen to the philosophers, right? But they have the tools in terms of literacy and in terms of education, and even in terms of, this may be seeming lame, but even in terms of nutrition, right? Like they're not starving, they have everything, and that's what I find so infuriating and perverse about modernity. Your phone, the stuff you said today, like Sonda, I didn't know what that was. Okay, and I googled it and I found out so much. But it is that the fact that maybe when I looked at that site, there were like 10 other people who looked at it. That shouldn't deter me, right?
Right.
We are going along with the current as much as our predecessors, whereas ideally we should have been more critical by them. Because why did the church dominate the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages? Because no one else could read. Only the clergy could read, right? Now we can. It's actually, it reflects worse on us because we are not doing what we can. So there's this quote. I mean, I think it's from, maybe it's a words of wisdom from ancient Greek philosopher. I don't know which one. The man who refuses to read has no advantage over the man who cannot read. Yeah, we have that ability. Everyone is almost literate now. What are we doing? Yeah, don't go with the current of this hegemony. Capitalism is really good to put food on the table. It is better than any other system tried alternatively. And that's it. That is the limits of it. But we buy in. Mimesis, right? Yeah. The test of the litmus test of an intellect is,
Exactly.
Can you buck the trend and think for yourself? And I don't see.
I also think a lot of this has to do with the law of averages, right? The principle that suggests that the frequency of occurrences in your environment corresponds to the probability that you adhere to it too, right? Because humans are highly susceptible to influence. We've already sort of discussed extensively. We inevitably are going to mimic what everything in our surroundings says, and like you have to proactively surround yourself with attributes and people that reflect the future you want to achieve. And without that sort of editing of your environment and the people around you, you almost inadvertently succumb to the very cycle that we've been talking about for this whole time. And there's actually a pretty interesting study on this too. And again, I don't know why I have this many case studies referred and ready, and I seem to love my case studies, but it's called the Framingham Heart Study. If you've heard of it.
I didn't hear of it. I haven't heard of it until you mentioned it in your brief, and I read up on it. Yeah,
right. It's where they tracked around 4,000 people for 2 decades. And well, although the original study was to study heart health conditions, it turned into this discovery of how emotions spread, like literally spread like a virus. And I'm going to use happiness as an example, although we've established that it's simply just an emotion. But if say, your friend is happy, the probability of you being happy by interacting with
emotional contagion.
goes up by 15%. And okay, fine, like that makes sense, right? You interact with a friend, you're happy, it's whatever. But this degree of connection goes up to three different people, which means you interacting with a friend was probably affected by someone he interacted with who you've never met. And a stranger
Yeah.
connected to someone you know is statistically affecting your mood, your well-being, your life, your
Yeah.
philosophies. And this is not self-help fluff, it's real data, and it shows that emotions, learned experiences, and the spread of information is actually a collective phenomenon, and it moves through social networks the same way a cold does, or
Yeah, it's like basically the
yeah.
genesis of the word viral, right? Like
Yes,
that's why they
yes,
say it's viral. What's a viral? It's not like viruses only have viral by
exactly.
definition, right? Like there is that, but that has a lot of positive impacts. Like herd behavior is basically what Gerard is like looking at, right?
Yes,
That has positives, and it's obvious why evolution pre-programmed or even evolution selected for that, because collective action toward a goal is what brought humans to this prosperous stage we are in. But like most positive things, there is that other side of it where it can, like Nazism, right? Like where, the German people, it's swept under the carpet to varying degrees now, but, they did buy into Nazi. There's no way that a few isolated, like a fringe party could do what it did to Europe and the world without that. So I guess it just comes down to this thing that it is herd behavior is natural, but whom we follow and when we follow has to always be evaluated critically, since the masses have proven over the ages that they do not have a particular proclivity and an aptitude towards which values and ideas to follow. Which is all, it's basically like, I don't know, I mean, like, it's basically what Plato said, right? The philosopher king. And even if you don't talk about the king, society has always and will always need philosophers to help them along in deciphering and distinguishing that which to follow and to help unpack why, and also that which not to follow, and in the absence of which the Hitlers and the Trumps are elected. They are elected, right? Never forget, most dictators are elected. Most of the worst, the depths of humanity were not coerced, right? 1931, January 30th, right? When Hitler came to power, when he was appointed chancellor, these did win enough votes initially, at least. I mean, not initially, but afterwards, right? So this is why far more important than any profession. We got your doctors, we got your all these kinds of professions, but man is so eager, is almost eager, they dismiss and vanquish and, usurp the role of the philosopher in society, right? It's like the very reason that, look at the feminist movement, look at equal rights. These are things which are rooted in like the philosophy of John Stuart Mill, eugenism, and I mean, animals can't speak, but look at the animal rights movement, Jeremy Bentham. Look at the a lot of the foundation upon which science can work well and markets can work well, if you trace them back, it's very unsexy. But it's thoughts by philosophers, right? Look at the thought that there is no divine right of kings and that man should pursue the rights, the inalienable rights. These are all philosophical thoughts. And any age and every age seems to do it. They piggyback on philosophical progress and they immediately forget that. They immediately discard the giant upon which they have seen further than other people. Right. And this is why history goes forward and backward, right? And this must be the trajectory. I mean, it almost seems like it must be the trajectory of history, right? America was founded on certain, and it was being disingenuous because they were founded on ideas which they themselves did not actuate, right? Like all men are born equal. Not really. It's white men who have property, who have no debt. But that ideal is a very much a philosophical thing. And now they've totally forgotten about it, right? And this must be the human condition, I must say, right? And despite it being the human condition, it is still the job of philosophers and the thinking people in a society to start again that positive cycle, because I don't think we are in it now. Everywhere democracy is in retreat, right? Like, name one place in the 90s, they declared that all kinds of autocracy were dead. Democracy has won, and Francis Fukuyama even wrote this very excessively premature and optimistic thing, the end of history and the last man, because everything, we have finally found the last stage of human history. Yeah, and now everywhere democracy is integrated. There is a cyclical progress of one step forward, and I don't know whether it's two steps back, but definitely backwards. So I feel that it's, the job of young people like you to get. Look, people may disagree with everything we said tonight, but what the one thing they can take away is they started introspecting.
Yes.
Yeah. And you brought up a word which is, I know it, but I can't remember the last time I heard it, extrospecting, right? Okay. And that is philosophy, right? It's just thinking. And in that, they will find progress. They can discard all the ideas we've had. But otherwise, it's back to Rene Girard and just mimicking. This is why Oscar Wilde said, I don't remember the exact quote, most people are other people, their passions are, yeah. And it's a beautiful quote, quite disappointed I don't remember every word of it. It's a beautiful quote which sums it up, which is a nice way to sort of sum everything up here. Or be careful, start thinking for yourself. In the process of thinking for yourself, it's like, if you seem fit, but if you want to get fit, maybe your friend will suggest gym, which is akin to analogous to thinking, but also personal trainer. So try to use the philosophers, and here's the test of who is a genuine philosopher. There's no profit in it, is there? Okay? Because a lot of people who stand up to be philosophers are sophists who say a lot of complicated stuff. Yeah? But it's for personal gain. Whereas if you look at the lot of philosophers in history, it didn't end up with gold-plated castles, right? It often ended up on the wrong side of the dictator or so on. So look at those divergent voices. Yeah, they often have more to add to your life than the person who's on his fifth edition of How to Be Happy for the Rest of Your Life ever. Because it's clearly something that pleases you to get your, to get that $9.99 on their paperback.
And
yeah,
I've actually found the quote from Oscar Wilde, and I think it sums up everything pretty well. So we can read out the quote and end a long 2.5-hour discussion here.
Yeah. Don't worry, AI will help you edit it out, edit all the arms and yeah.
Yeah, the file right now reads 5.5 gigabytes, and I have no idea how I'm gonna get all of this edited. But so the Oscar Wilde quote was, most people are other people, their thoughts are someone else's opinions, their lives a mimicry, their passion a quotation.
Wow, I loved it. I didn't even remember the fact that he used the word mimicry, because that takes us full circle to the theme of today about imitating people's desires. I guess I'd say, just to get a parting thing, I know this is sort of maybe not the smoothest way to end this, but I'll say, don't be a non-conformist for the sake of it, because and that's the fine balance, right? There's just rebellion, rebel without a cause, rebellion just for the sake of it. And that's more playing the role of non-conformist, but really it's not about conforming or non-conforming, because non-conforming seems like a cool thing to say. I'm a non-conformist seems like basically no one boasts brands saying that I'm a conformist. But I think it's about, and it's a lot of work, it's about taking each and everything you do in your life and you've been prescribed and questioning it, is basically applying the Socratic method, but without Socrates haranguing you and pestering you, right? It's basically about being a critical thinker, and after the critical passing of the particular thing, perhaps there's many instances to go with things, right? Like most laws I would abide by, and maybe I would abide by it because of threat of punishment of all laws, but there are most things in society or a good chunk are very positive things to do. So I wouldn't say just say, oh, you should be a non-conformist for the sake of it. There's a lot of things to follow the current. Yeah. But it's those things which when we get into that habit and then we follow everything that, yeah, so it is it's not very it's not a thing to not a sexy thing to lead people with, but it's a case by case task throughout your whole life, right? And it's a lot of intellectual work. What I find, just to leave off with Tripulesh, which is why I'm so proud of a person like you, is just like modern man and man in general, I haven't found an epidemic of laziness in terms of, but what I found is like, when you're a kid and parents are like, you're lazy, work harder. I've not found laziness as an epidemic, but I have found intellectual laziness. Like, people are working so hard, they don't have enough left to think hard. But I would rather, think and then do. Yeah. So that shouldn't be the case with well fed, literate, educated people. Thinking shouldn't be such an uphill battle and something you're so averse. Basically, what I was saying was like, in the end, it's not very sexy, it's not very, it's not flamboyant, there's not much bravado in this, but it's basically doing the work to think. And we have the tools because we have literacy, we have nutrition, and we have education far more, and we have the internet, yeah. But it's that critical faculty which we should not, which we should focus on. No, basically, there's no excuse for modern man manipulation. Yeah, the excuses which the reasons, they were reasons before. Look, if you're illiterate, and the only book is the Bible, and the only person who can read that is the cleric, that's a reason, not an excuse. Today, the internet has great sources too. Yeah, you're not hungry. You've had a decent education, which is whatever maybe it may not be the best available today, but is far better than your predecessors. So the fact that people do not think and follow the herd is more disappointing and dispiriting today. So I ask people to, capitalize on the gains of man to start thinking critically and philosophically.
And I think that is a good sentiment to wrap up on. Well,
Definitely.
thank you for doing this.
It's my
Hopefully I can
pleasure.
do. Yeah, hopefully I keep doing this, and there'll be some more episodes
Yeah.
eventually.
And I just want to say, like, I know this is not how you end podcast, but like, and we didn't plan this. We haven't even barely talked about this before. But Vipul, great credit to you for doing this at your age. And I told my best friend as well. I said, look, there are many people who do this for like maybe ambitious reasons, maybe scholarships, and maybe other reasons. But it's very clear that you're doing this for the pure love of philosophy and the appreciation of its impact. So that is that purity and that sort of like unadulterated passion and verve is very rare today, because like we're not going to make any money out of this. We're not going to get anything other than the satisfaction that we contributed something, and obviously just doing it was very fulfilling and enjoyable. But I think I noticed that in you, whereas I feel that with some others it's about podcasts, how we can market this, and it goes back into getting subsumed by capitalism. Whereas here we're using the platforms capitalism has afforded to basically take us back to a type of ancient Greece town square afforded to us digitally by capitalism, without then trying to make it sort of like a career and a source of income. So that's very creditable. I've got to say that. Like we didn't discuss this, and I'm just saying that off the cuff. So that's continue that. I would say continue. It's invaluable. Maybe there'll be like zero listeners now, although there were earlier for the earlier one, but I'm sure someone's going to unearth this and it's going to be of benefit, because that's how I got here. I unearthed a lot of things which have been buried under, the mainstream, and that helped me
Thank
immeasurably
you.
so.
Thanks. I'm really flattered, but of course you introduced me to philosophy when I was only 17 years old, so part of the credit goes to you.
Thanks. That's flattering too. It's a great
Right.
compliment.
I guess that's a happy note to end on.